Welcome to this presentation on simulation of necessary conditions of world peace, leveraging a quaternary-based quintuple-layered complex adaptive systems model. I am Praveer Malik, and this presentation is based on a paper by the same name, submitted to EAMOT 2021 and organized by EAMOT and Nile University. Over the next 15 minutes, I will like to briefly go over some of the assumptions that have been used in this complex adaptive system. And then, since we are focused on a simulation, I will run through the initial conditions and setup, and then draw attention to a number of surfacings of this simulation in terms of boundary conditions and a variety of scenarios that themselves are based on two key parameters behind this model. And finally, I will conclude. The creation of world peace is, of course, here approached in terms of complex adaptive systems theory. So very briefly, a complex adaptive system can be thought of as a system that comprises of a number of independent, autonomous, interacting units in which there is no centralized control. And yet, such a system, as research indicates, remains one of the most resilient systems in existence. In this model, I have essentially taken a quaternary-based quintuple-layered approach. And I want to draw attention to the fact that usually when a cast is modeled, it's as a single layer. So why 5 layers over here? I'll go with that in a minute. The quaternary basis highlights 4 organizational principles, and these are referred to as knowledge, power, service, and harmony, that can be thought of as 4 independent sources of innovation. And research indicates that a sustainable system has, in fact, all 4 of these sources of innovation active and all acting in unison. And this is true regardless of the granularity of the system. So it may be a physical system, a chemical system, a biological system, or a complex organizational system. The 5 layers comprise essentially of the living cell layer, which is the basis of all life. So whether it's plant life, animal life, or human life. The nature-based ecosystem services layer, and these are services that we take for granted, such as food production, air filtration, water purification, carbon sequestration, and so on. The human dynamics layer, which is typically what a system might be modeled around. And then 2 subsequent layers, that of culture due to human dynamics, which then obviously then also influences human-based organizations. And finally, the layer of countries or nations that typically develop along some unique national genius. In this model, the interaction of these 5 layers is seen as fundamental, and that's in fact what the simulation is based on. So to summarize, what we have in this simulation is essentially the action of the 4 organizational principles on each of the 5 interacting layers. Now, for basis of simplification, this model is based on aggregated interaction between the distributed, autonomous, independent agents. Shifting focus here to the initial conditions and setup, what I want to draw attention to here, so this represents the entirety of the model. And if we focus on the different aspects of it, we have the central area, which has this blue boundary, and essentially the quintuple layers are represented over here. So we have the human dynamics layer, we have the cultural dynamics and ecosystems layer, and then the further removed country level dynamics and cellular dynamics layers. So that represents the quintuple system, but then we also have different regions in the world. And then finally, we have the final outcome that shows up as variations in world peace. Now, the green area over here draws attention to the 4 organizational principles or sources of innovation. So these may vary, and this variation is fundamentally important, as I'll go over in just a couple of minutes. And then secondly is the same layer. And here the indication is to what level these 4 sources of innovation effectively ripple through the 5 layers of this CAS model. Finally is the red areas that draw attention to basic volatility that exists in the system. So in the absence of any kind of intervention, we have the status quo trend, which would show how world peace may fluctuate cyclically over a period of time. And then in addition, we have variance that occurs regionally and then globally as well. Here, I just draw attention to some sample feedback loops and just focusing on human dynamics. It's showing the interaction between how human dynamics influences cultural dynamics and human dynamics influences country level dynamics and so on, but then also how each of these dynamics influences human dynamics in return. And therefore you can see the implicit complexity in such a system where you have a number of different feedback loops. I've already talked about the sources of volatility and also the sources of innovation. I want to draw attention to the fact that in this model using Insight Maker, each of these sources of innovation and the way that they are organized or ripple through the system are represented by levers that then allow variation in the model. So now considering different surfacings of the simulation itself, and here I focus initially on the development and organizational boundary conditions. So I'm going to draw attention to this region over here, which essentially focuses on the 4 sources of innovation and how they are organized or can propagate through the entire CAS. And what we see here is that everything is completely strung to the left, meaning that we have minimum development in terms of the 4 sources of innovation and also minimum organization. And when these conditions are true, then we get a baseline reading of how world peace, which is the large, essentially the orange line, fluctuates over time. And this is a 20-year period. And we can see that if there's an initial condition that's represented by 0, then we have world peace trending negatively by a factor of down to about minus 16 or so. So some multiple of the initial condition with which this simulation started out. When we take the boundary condition of having minimum development but maximum organization, this draws attention to the fact that world peace now over a 20-year period becomes exponentially negative, meaning that the influence of organizing is very high. When we take the scenario of maximum development, so we'll see here the levers are such that the sources of innovation are all strung to the right, but organization is all strung to the left. Then we have essentially world peace fluctuating in a positive direction, but to a factor that is contained and at the maximum reaches a factor of 12 from the base condition. And when we have all the sources of innovation and the effect of a systematized organization strung to the right, then we have the potentiality of exponentially increasing world peace over a 20-year period. So these are the boundary conditions. And now we shift attention to various typical scenarios that will occur between these boundary conditions. So taking a first situation in which we have an adverse mindset that's essentially represented by the sources of innovation all strung to the left. So we can see that the values are all a -10. And then you have a completely neutral organization. So it's haphazard. This green line here represents the status quo trend. So if we take 0 to be a base condition, then over a 20-year period, we can see that there's a cyclicity in essentially the conditions of the world, but they all are strung between a small factor of between -4 and +4 approximately. The quintuple dynamics that ripple through in such a scenario tend over time to become increasingly negative, but again are strung within a bounded condition of reaching a maximum factor of -40. And this in turn influences the regional flows so that we can see that over time, again, there's a general negative trend that is now a multiple of the -40. And then world peace becomes a multiple of the negativity that we saw in regional flows. So we see a maximum negativity of down to a factor of a -140 as compared to the initial condition. And again, this is with the adverse mindset, but in the middle organization. Now, if we consider a scenario of a neutral mindset and in the middle organization, then the status quo remains the same. And this, of course, is randomly generated, so it's going to be slightly different, but yet we can see a cyclical pattern over here. But importantly, the sources of innovation are neither negative nor positive, but in the middle. And the same is true of the rippling of organization. And then we see that the quintuple dynamics tend to, as expected, be centered around the base condition, but can increase in one direction or the other over time. And what we begin to see in this scenario in terms of the regional flows or the peace that exists regionally in different parts of the world is, again, overall a slightly negative trend, but bound within fairly tight conditions. And the world peace is also tending to negatively over a 20-year period, but only slightly, as can be seen by the negative factor of a maximum of -10 and a positive of +4. Now we get to the most interesting situation, which has above average organization and is approaching the full fourfoldness. And this is represented by a number of stages in which we'll see different representations of world peace. So in the first situation, you've got only one of the 4 sources of innovation fully active, while the others remain adverse. And you have higher than normal levels of organization. So this pattern ripples through all the quintuple layers and then regional flows of this gas. And in general, we see that it tends negatively over a 20-year period. When we look at the second scenario with 2 sources of innovation fully active and 2 absolutely not, and the same level of organization, we begin to see a fluctuation that varies negatively and positively, but again is bounded by a finite factor. And in this third situation, we have 3 of the sources of innovation fully active, and we can see now a definite positive trend that we see increasing over a 20-year period. And when we take all four of these situations active, but we're still not at the boundary condition because the level of organization is not strung completely to the right, we see again that there is a massive increase in the potential of world peace. And this, by the way, is if we look at, again, any physical, chemical, biological system and the jump that a system makes from one kind of operation to the next, we'll notice that these four sources of innovation are fully active in such systems. And so if they're fully active in the world, then we would expect a similar leap in the possibility of world peace. So summarizing, while typical scenarios fall between the reality set up by extreme boundary conditions, we see a significant trend that occurs as more possibility in terms of the fourfoldness or source of innovation is mobilized. And so with only one of the quaternary bases active, we see world peace will stumble along in a mildly negative way. With any two of the quaternary bases active, we'll see that there's higher carry forward and world peace will fluctuate between mildly negative and mildly positive values over the years. With any three of the quaternary bases active, world peace will tend to increase by some multiple of 10. And with all four quaternary bases active, and given the high carry forward of organizational integrity, world peace will tend toward exponential positive growth toward the end of 20 years. So, thank you. That brings this presentation to an end. Thank you.